Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video, which is my book bracket, my belated book bracket for the first few months of 2022. So if you're new to my channel, hello, welcome. My book bracket is essentially my response to my FOMO over not being able to participate in any athletic related brackets because I know nothing about sports. So every quarter I like to put my 5-star books that I read in the last few months in a competition where I debate with myself on camera and try to decide which book is my favorite for that quarter. Fun, right? No, it actually is a bit traumatizing. It's not an easy thing to do, but I am a glutton for punishment, so here we are starting year 2 of my book bracket series. But before I even get into the book bracket itself, I always like to talk about my stats and what I've been up to in the last quarter. So that's what we're going to do first. There will be a timestamp so you can skip right ahead to the bracket if numbers are not your thing. Totally fine. But why don't we dive right in? Okay, so first and foremost, I read 19 books for the first 3 months of 2022, so January through March, which is a slower start to the year than I'm used to, but there's been a lot of personal stuff going on, a lot of stressful things that have made reading take the back seat a little bit, as I've said in several videos. So considering all of that, I'm pretty pleased with 19 books. But let's look at the breakdown for those books. So if we look at fiction versus nonfiction, I've read 16 fictions and then 3 nonfictions, which means that I am doing abysmally when it comes to my yearly goal of trying to read 30% nonfiction. But, I haven't been gravitating towards nonfiction as much at this point in the year, just because I think it's maybe a little too much considering current events. I am someone who really gravitates primarily towards historical nonfiction, and especially historical fiction, and especially historical nonfiction about wars and revolutions, and considering there's so much talk about World War III and everything that's going on in Ukraine, maybe in some cases it's a little bit too close for home. I think right now I am kind of in that place where I like fiction because it's very escapist, even if it is looking at wars. You can kind of just immerse yourself in that world and not think about the real world. It's like an alternate universe. So I like the alternate universe, the alternate realities of fiction right now a little bit more than the realities of nonfiction, and that's totally fine. I'm sure it will pick up and things will change in a few months. Or at least I hope so. But then let's actually look at the breakdown of genres. So I read 5 literary fictions, 1 romance, 3 historical fictions, 4 classics, 1 mystery, 3 nonfiction, which I've already mentioned, 1 play, and then 1 sci-fi fantasy. Now, this is one of the rare occasions when historical fiction isn't the predominant genre that I've read. Literary fiction and classics including sort of modern classics and books that aren't in the traditional canon, took up most of the books I read. Between those 2 genres, that's 9 books. That's nearly half of what I read. So that seems to be where my headspace was, and even given the books that I chose for my May TBR, that just seems to be a place of interest right now. So I don't hate it. Surprisingly though, there was a sci-fi fantasy book on this list, and that was a book that we read for the Found in Translation book club. So that's why that's there. Otherwise, you will never see that category in any of my book brackets. So moving on to some more stats, we have format. So unsurprisingly, 16 were physical books and 3 were audio. I am definitely more of a physical book reader. I am a physical book collector as well, as you can see. For me, audiobooks are fun. I like them, but I definitely have not been reading or listening to as many of them recently. I tend to listen to them when I'm working and doing things that are more sort of repetitive and don't require me to engage my brain too much. There hasn't been a ton of that recently, truth be told. But I've also been listening to podcasts a lot of the time because as much as I want to escape the reality of current events, I also want to know what the heck is happening in the world. So I've been listening to a lot of podcasts that are analyzing things. And so my audiobook time has definitely been reduced because of all of those things. And then the other sort of fun stat that I've introduced this year, this was not in my stats from last year, is translated works. So this time around I read 15 books that were originally written in English, and then I read 4 books that were translated. So we have that to chew on. How about that? Now we start getting into the star ratings portion of this video, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is how I decide which books end up in the book bracket. The only books that make it there are my 5 stars. But let's look first at the other books and other star ratings that I gave, and there are many. Now that I use the story graph, I have lots of fractional ratings, which I love and I think are more honest, but it does add a texture to your star ratings when you look at them this way. So firstly, I do have one book that I didn't give a rating to, and that was Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. I don't always like to give memoirs ratings because I respect how much vulnerability a writer has to allow for themselves in order to do that, and I respect that, as I said. Like, that's tough. But in this case, I also didn't want to give it a rating because I didn't necessarily enjoy the book, and I think that was more a case of me going into it with expectations that were very different from what the focus of the book was. So that was more a personal thing there. My lowest rating of the quarter, though, was a 2.5 star, which was Strange Beasts of China, which was the book that I read for the Found in Translation book club. It was the one sci-fi fantasy book that I've read this year. So there is that. Then we had 2 3-star books, 4 3.5 star books, and then 2 3.75 star books. So we had a significant number of books that were kind of fair to middling. I enjoyed them enough, but they weren't favorites of mine. They're not books that I see myself rereading, and you will likely see them in one of my quarterly book haul videos that is to come. And then the last of the ratings that I had, we had 4 4-star books, 2 4.5 star books, and then lastly we had 3 5-star books. And those 3 books are the ones that are going into the book bracket. So what are those books, you might be asking? Wonderful, wonderful question. The 3 books that were 5 stars for me were Moon Tiger by Penelope Lively, which this is a literary fiction. It was written, I want to say, in the late 1980s. It's also a Booker Prize winner. And it's the story of this writer, Claudia, who is, at the time that the book starts off, an elderly woman on her deathbed, and she decides to write a history of the world, but a history of the world according to Claudia and through the lens of Claudia's life. So you get a sense of how big her ego is. And the book is largely told through a series of memories and really explores her relationship with significant figures in her life. There is her brother, with whom she has this somewhat incestuous connection with, and this hilarious rivalry. There is her daughter. There is her daughter's father, who is a man that she did not marry, and also the love of her life. And the book spans her entire life, as you would expect, some of which takes place during World War II. And it was just one of those books that is really intelligently written and Claudia's like narrative voice just did me in. I loved it. So that was part of why that book was a 5-star read for me. I just enjoyed the entire thing. It's one of those books that you definitely wish you could read for the first time again. The next book is Passing by Nella Larsen, which was a reread for me. This is a modern classic. It was written during the Harlem Renaissance, and it explores race, identity, and also colorism. The two main characters are these women that knew each other growing up. They are both white-passing Black women, but they have chosen different paths. One woman, Claire, has decided to pass for white, and she's married to a racist. And then the other woman, Irene, lives in Harlem, is part of that Black community and the movement there. And so when their two worlds collide, it's this really interesting sort of frenetic, I guess, relationship where they're, in Irene's case, she's both drawn to Claire in a way that almost seems erotic and also repulsed by her at the same time. So there's some interesting stuff going on there. And the ending of this book is one of those books that I need more people to read it so that I can talk about it. Because I can't talk about it here because it's a spoiler, obviously, but I need to talk about it with someone. So there's that book. And then the other book is Regeneration by Pat Barker, which is the first book in the Regeneration trilogy, which is a World War I historical fiction trilogy. And this is all about these men who have been to war in the trenches, and they are suffering from what we now call PTSD, but at the time it wasn't really diagnosed. But the PTSD manifests itself in a lot of psychological and physical ways, and these soldiers, these brave men, are sent to a military hospital where a psychiatrist is meant to help them get better so that he can send them back. And one of the main characters is a war hero that starts pushing back, starts kind of seeing reasons why people shouldn't be involved in the war, and really opposes it. And it's just a really interesting look at World War I and sort of this anti-war movement, pacifism, and also just like this look at the effects of war, not just on the physical body, but kind of on the mind, like the psyche of both the society and the individuals actually fighting the war. So it is one of these books that is very, very heavy, but also very, very compelling and interesting. So those are my like elevator pitches for the books. But now for the book bracket, what normally happens is that I have a set of questions that I ask myself that I talk through. Generally, when I have a significant number of books, each time I go through one of the questions, I try to eliminate a book. That's not going to happen this time because there are only 3 books, so we're going to deal with this a little bit differently. But why don't we get to the fun stuff? The stuff where I make myself sweat and stress out and basically talk to myself. That's what's happening now. So the first of the questions that actually will eliminate one of the books, unfortunately, is the question, are any of these a reread? I don't keep rereads in my book bracket just because I feel like it's a bit as if you're stacking the deck, because I only reread books that are favorites of mine, books that I really enjoy, and so you don't want to put that in with the new books in my mind. So in this case, unfortunately, that means Passing by Nella Larsen is going to have to go. This is truly one of my favorite books of all time. I have an entire video on this one book. It was my first attempt at like a book talk on one book, so if you want to hear more about it there. But it is definitely a book that resonated with me on a personal level because I am a white passing woman of color, and also is just such an interesting analysis of like society at that given moment. It's one of these classics that I wish people read it instead of The Great Gatsby, because as much as I enjoy The Great Gatsby, don't get me wrong, this book I just feel like could create so many interesting conversations among high schoolers, and worthy conversations among high schoolers. So sad to see it go, but it is one of my favorite books. I'm sure you will hear about it plenty in the future on this channel. The next question that I always ask myself is, did this book make me want to read other books by the author? Which to me is one of the most telling questions, because if the answer is yes, then I really had a good time. And I become like a serious fangirl in those instances. And in both cases, with Moon Tiger and with Regeneration, the answer is yes. So with Moon Tiger, this was a book by an author that I had never heard of before. To be honest, it was an instance of the cover really intriguing me when I was like trolling some book website, and I was like, let's give it a shot. But I knew nothing about Penelope Lively. Now I know that she's written a number of children's books, like a significant number, as well as quite a few adult fiction. And given how much I enjoyed her writing style in Moon Tiger, I would definitely be interested in exploring some of the other books in her adult fiction backlist, because her writing style was just so sharp, so clever, that it was just a wild ride. It was one of those books that it just oozed intelligence, and not in that like pretentious way that some literary fiction can. It was accessible, it was enjoyable, it was like having that sarcastic or witty friend in the room with you the entire time you were reading it. And the way that she created the character of Claudia, who is just vibrant and larger than life, like, if she can do that again in other books, it'll just be amazing. Because after reading that book, I was just like, Claudia is one of my favorite literary characters. Like, no contest. I just thoroughly enjoyed her voice. I thoroughly enjoyed the observations of the world that were encapsulated in this book. And as I said, it just felt smart. So I liked that. I liked that quite a lot. So definitely a yes there. When it comes to Regeneration by Pat Barker, I've already read several books by Pat Barker on this channel. I've read her duology that was historical fiction set in ancient Greece, The Silence of the Girls, and Women of Troy. And those were the books that really hooked me on her originally. And so that's why I picked up Regeneration. And you will have already seen my May TBR, but I want to read the other two books in this trilogy in May. So it's happening soon. And I also am trying to get my hands on another series of hers, which unfortunately I don't think is available in the US, or it's out of print in the US currently. So I'm having to do some like internet sleuthing and try to get like used editions or editions from the UK. So far I've managed to get 2 of the books in the trilogy, but I'm missing the book in the middle. I'm missing book 2. So that's a little bit of a party problem. But obviously I am very interested in reading more books by Pat Barker, so the answer is yes. So both of the books are still in contention. Next, I usually use a gut feeling. Usually. I'm going to save that for the end though, just in case I need it, just because there are only 2 books. So the next question is, does the book make me think, or did the book make me think? And this to me is one of the reasons why when I'm stressed I don't read, because I tend to really enjoy books that engage that part of your mind and do make you think. And think not necessarily just in learning facts, but just make you empathetic and teach you like emotional intelligence, if that makes any sense, because I do think that goes hand in hand with reading and being a reader. So for me, it's a really important part of the reading process. And when it comes to these 2 books, I think the answer is yes for both of them, but for different reasons, I would say. I think in the case of Regeneration, because it's focused on World War I, so an actual event, it's exploring a part of the war and the history that I really haven't seen covered that much in fiction, or really in much of the nonfiction that I've read, because it's kind of the stuff that you don't want to talk about. The like resistance to being in the war, and the like toll that it has on individuals, and the way that the public reacts to it. So it's kind of the unsavory bits of the war that this book is addressing, because the book is looking at these men who have fought and who might be physically fine, or at least appear physically fine, unlike some of their comrades. They haven't lost limbs or been maimed in that sort of way, but they're scarred nonetheless. These are men who have both physical and mental manifestations of the horrors of war, and it is genuinely heartbreaking to hear about them and to read about how they have to cope and how they're being told to get on with it so that they can go back into the trenches. It raises questions about morality and what is right and what is wrong in a really interesting way. But you know, the questions that are raised by one of the main characters, Sassoon, are just so thought-provoking, because it really makes you start to question what makes a war justified, and makes you question the powers that be that send men to war. Like, they're not the ones in the trenches, and they're sending people off. So it is really interesting, because for me, I really want to say it's the first like anti-war fiction that I've actually read. And I feel like I'm learning a lot from it, which is interesting. And the characters, as I said, are just characters that my heart genuinely bleeds for, because yes, these are fictional individuals, but there were men like them. So there is that. When it comes to Moon Tiger, it's a little bit different, because I do feel like the thinking that this book makes me do is more like the sort of literary analysis, the English major part of my brain that turns on, because it's not, while World War II happens during the course of the book, it's not focused on that. It's really more focused on the relationship between Claudia and these other characters. And for me, it's just interesting to see how the book is really kind of looking at history, like personal history and the quote-unquote official history, and kind of the weird way that they kind of blend here. And also looking at memory, because a large chunk of the book is told sort of episodically, looking at these important moments in Claudia's life and how she remembers them, but in some cases you also get how the other person sees the situation. So there's something about memory there, but it's those types of things that I find interesting about the book. So there's that. It's not the same as with Regeneration, and honestly, while it does, Moon Tiger makes me think, I would say arguably that Regeneration makes me think more. So we do have a point for Regeneration here that we do not have for Moon Tiger currently. So let's think on that for a little bit. Alrighty then. So the next question is actually a new one. So last year I had this sort of character magnetism question, which worked fine for fiction, but when I started having nonfiction in the mix, it really didn't work quite as well as I had hoped. So kind of towards the end of the year, in trying to explain this question, realize that it's more a case of answering that age-old question, if you could invite 3 people to dinner, who would it be? But in this case, it's a case of, would I want the main characters at a dinner party with me, or would I want the subject of the nonfiction at a dinner party with me? Yes or no, and why? And that to me just felt like a fun way to look at it, and also kind of gives you this leeway, because you might want a character who is somewhat unlikable or gray at your dinner party just because they're interesting. Like, you would just like to kind of chew the fat with them. Is that the expression? Man, I'm horrible. I'm sorry. Anyway, but yeah, so the question here in a nutshell is, would I want the main characters from these 2 books at a dinner party with me? And when it comes to Moon Tiger, the answer is a, like, jump for joy, super enthusiastic yes. Claudia, as I mentioned, is now one of my favorite characters in literature. I thoroughly enjoyed her. She does have an ego, that doesn't bother me. I just liked the way that she viewed the world. I liked that she was a little bit sarcastic. I liked that she was as smart as a whip. I really enjoyed listening to her argue with different people. When she's bickering with her brother, it's hilarious. When she's arguing with her daughter's father, equally hilarious. There was just so much variety and layer there. But then to also see her, like, fall in love and see what happens when, sadly, that man dies. There were just so many layers to her. But overall, she's just one of these characters that, is she 100% likable? No. But would I want to have her at a dinner table? Absolutely, because I feel like she would tell the best stories, she would make everyone laugh, she would just be like the life of the party. She was just this really big, boisterous character, and I liked it. I liked it so much. Like, she's one of those characters that I wish was a real person, because I would be her biggest fan. So, Moon Tiger, absolutely. When it comes to regeneration, there's kind of like a cast of characters. There's Sassoon, who I already mentioned, who's the war hero that is now lost his desire to fight for other people. And then there's also the Dr. Rivers, as well as some other soldiers who are kind of more supporting characters. And I would actually really be intrigued to have just about any of those men at a dinner party. Because, first of all, the war stories, but also with the case of, like, Sassoon, hearing him articulate why he is now against the war and why he's now objecting to fighting it himself, I think would be so interesting. That's part of why I want to read the other books, because I want to hear more of his perspective. This is a man who is actually in the trenches. He's a war hero, for crying out loud, and suddenly he's not into it. Like, he's decided, no, I've had enough. I don't want to be here. And so just to get that perspective from him, I think would be really, really interesting, because it's, as I've said, a totally different perspective from anything else I've read. I think sometimes the, like, problem of the war-focused, like, historical fiction is that it can glorify war. It celebrates the heroes, and it celebrates and glorifies the losses, and it doesn't always give you the most realistic take on kind of the sacrifice, or the sacrifice itself is kind of secondary or a plot device, whereas the entire book is focused on these men who have made sacrifice and whether or not they're willing to do it again. And so I would be interested to have a conversation with Sassoon. And honestly, I would be interested in having a conversation with Dr. Rivers, who is trying to treat these men, because by the end of this book, you're starting to see that maybe he doesn't believe that what he's doing is quite as right as he might have started out believing. He starts questioning things because of what he's seen with Sassoon, what he's seen with the other men he's treating, and he would be an interesting person to talk to just because he's the doctor and he's kind of on the other side of this, thinking like, yeah, I'm gonna get these men back on track and they'll go back to war. At least that's how he starts out. So in both cases, these two men are really fascinating and would be, I think, great dinner guests. But if I had to give a point to either of these books, which is very much the point of this book bracket, I would say that the point would go to Moon Tiger. Because Moon Tiger is definitely the one with Claudia that, yeah, no, she has to be at my dinner party. She'll be at them forever now. The next of my questions criteria is this a book that is immersive or transportive? And you know, they are, but not in the traditional sense. I think because both of these books tend to skew more on the literary side of things, the world building element, even though they're historical fiction, isn't as important to the piece. And I mean that in a way that's not to like poo-poo them, but like with Regeneration, for example, it's not necessarily a case that I feel myself transported to Craig's Lockhart War Hospital. That's not the case. It's more that I am immersed in the feelings of the characters, that I sympathize with them, I empathize with them, and their stories and their struggles. Like, it's an emotional sort of immersion, as it were. And the same thing with Moon Tiger, although maybe to a slightly lesser degree. I absolutely love Claudia, as I mentioned, but I don't know if I would say I was as transported into her world or as immersed in her like psyche. I know that sounds a bit weird, but maybe you get what I'm getting at here. I do think that in a way she's kind of like, for me, a celebrity, like, for example, Helen Mirren, who I idolize, like, just idolize, and that's how I felt about Claudia. I idolize her as a character. I am totally hooked to her narrative voice and the way she sees the world, but immersed in her world? Probably not. Maybe a little bit, but probably not, now that I'm talking through it. So, if I had to give a point, probably Regeneration. So yeah, let's take stock for a moment. We're kinda, sorta-ish tied, not exactly. So if I really, really, really get down to the nitty-gritty, like, I think Regeneration was more immersive than Moon Tiger. But if I could only give a point to one for Dinner Party, I would give the point to Moon Tiger, not Regeneration. Both of them, I want to read books by the author, other books by the author. And if you take the, like, did it make it think, I would probably say leaning more towards Regeneration if I could only give a point. It's a weird thing, because I think technically Regeneration might have a half point or a point more. So, the question is now, do I go with that, or does gut feeling come into play? And this is something that I like to use because a lot of this sometimes comes down to just a gut feeling. Like, which book made you feel good? Which book got you really excited as a reader? And, like, point-wise, as I said, Regeneration is in the lead. Not by a ton. It's pretty close. but it's still a little bit ahead. So gut feeling, does that change anything here? For me, both books were 5-star, obviously, so I thoroughly enjoyed them. Am I super excited to read the other 2 books in the Regeneration trilogy? Absolutely. It's like, it gets me excited. It's the sort of book that is my bread and butter. It's my jam. It's a historical fiction about a war. Like, it really is up my alley. If I think about Moon Tiger, I read, I think, both of these books in January, actually. And if I think about it, Moon Tiger is the one of the 2 books that, like, is still very actively on my mind. It's a book that, as I mentioned earlier, I would really love to read for the first time again. I don't know anyone else that has read this book, but it was a book that I really connected with and really, really enjoyed because of the character of Claudia, for all of the reasons that I expressed already. There are certain quotations from that book that just hit me in the feels. There were some that were laugh out loud funny, and there were some that were just so true it kind of hurts. And man, what am I gonna do here? I think I'm gonna go with my gut here, which is Moon Tiger, just because it is very close to Regeneration point-wise, but of the 2 books, this is the one that's had the lasting impression. This is the book that I can see myself rereading and revisiting time and time again. It's a book that I think I, might have said was potentially a new favorite book of all time, and that's not just something that a bookish person says lightly, because favorite books, they earn it. Like, it's a thing. So I think, based on that, even though technically Regeneration might be a little ahead, my heart is telling me Moon Tiger by Penelope Lively was my favorite book of the quarter, and is likely going to be one of my favorite books of 2022 as well, although I can see Regeneration being up there too, truth be told. But yeah, I think that's my answer. I think Moon Tiger by Penelope Lively. So yeah, that's my Q1 book bracket. That is me choosing Moon Tiger as my favorite book of January, February, and March. Looking forward to seeing what book becomes my Q2 favorite, because after all of my reading for the year, I put my book bracket winners head to head and tried to decide what my favorite book of the year is. So we have one contender in the mix, and I'll be interested to see what it ends up going up against in the future. But in the meantime, I would love to know what your favorite read of the first few months of the year was, so let me know in the comment section, because I'm always looking for book recommendations. But I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, because all those things help this little channel grow, and they mean the world to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!